So I'm delighted to welcome you all, Imogeen and Binna, to today's GoodCourse EDI Leaders Roundtable. And of course, today's session is focusing in on how universities are delivering against their commitments to anti-racism. And in particular, in this conversation, we're going to be focusing on how Imogeen Denton, head of EDI at BCU, and the team are working to support Black students and staff in acknowledgement of the well-documented disparities they face in the higher education sector. And also, of course, what other universities can learn from the work that you've been doing, Imogeen, and how we can revisit or kickstart those plans. So to begin, just to warm us up, Imogeen, it would be fantastic if you could give our listeners, our viewers, a quick intro to yourself and your role at the university and your remit as EDI practitioner and your particular expertise, if you wouldn't mind.
Thanks, Kitty. So hi, as you said, I'm Imogeen Denton and I'm the head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Birmingham City University. In terms of my role, I kind of summarise it as saying I'm responsible for developing and implementing our university's EDI strategy, which includes making sure that we set equality objectives and manage performance against them. I also have to make sure that we have the correct governance framework in place to support EDI. So to give an example, we've got EDI committees across our faculties, professional service and main university. And then I'd say that it's about making sure that we integrate ED&I in our learning and development and training. So raising awareness, celebrating, and all those wonderful things connected to EDI.
Thank you so much, Imogeen. And of course, I'm also joined by my lovely co-host, Binna Candola. Binna, would you like to say a few words at this point?
Yeah, I'm Binna Candola. I'm the senior partner and chair at Pearl & Candola, a practice of business psychologists, and we specialise in diversity and inclusion. And it's great to be back here on this conversation we're going to have with Imogeen.
Yeah, I'm excited. So to begin, Imogeen, your anti-racism plan talks into your ambitions to address inequalities for both students and staff alike. But the problems that are faced by both groups can be actually fairly disparate in nature, whether that be sort of addressing the student awarding gap or the lack of representation of senior Black faculty members. So what I'd love to hear a little bit about is sort of when you sat down to create your plan, can you share some insights into where you started and how you got going?
Yes, I mean, that's really interesting. So, I mean, it all really started with the murder of George Floyd, which actually happened 2 years ago, almost to today. We're just a couple of days shy of that anniversary. And really, it was in terms of the dialogue and the response from the university, because as with many organisations, our university made a pledge to support students and staff and declared that it was going to stand with our Black students and staff and wanted to be part of the solution. And I guess my response at the time, I was angry. I felt as though, you know, all the work that we've been doing over these years, it didn't feel like it was enough. And I emailed our Vice Chancellor and said, you know, it's good that we're standing with our students and our staff, but actually I think it's more about dismantling some of the systemic issues that we have in terms of our systems and processes at the university. And I know that they had lots of discussion at our senior leadership level. And I was asked to support we had an executive dean that was here at the time, and our HR director in looking at what we would do. And so what we did was we got a small group together, which included our student representatives. We included our chair of our Race, Equity and Inclusion Network and our comms team, and actually started to think about, well, what are all of the things across the university where we need to make a difference? And so it was about bringing together key people and making sure that what we did was very much aligned to our main strategic plan. So the university strategy, our access and participation plan, as well as our EDI strategy, and looking across the different themes of work.
I know this year you and I'm straying slightly off of our prescribed agenda here, but I know this year you won an award for excellence in diversity and inclusion, and you're heading towards going for the Race Equality Charter Award. Am I correct there? I wonder if you can touch slightly on, because I know it's been in the press a lot, sort of the press and the politicians in recent weeks somewhat criticising the Race Equality Charter, and I wonder if you had any particular thoughts or comments on that criticism.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that the Race Equality Charter is really about making sure that we are being fair, being equitable in what we do. And it's about looking at, in line with our, if you like, our Black Lives Matter plan, it's looking at what we do across learning, teaching, assessment, what we do in terms of research and knowledge exchange, our people, values, leadership. So really, it's not about anything that we shouldn't already be doing from a social justice perspective. So I think in terms of the people that criticise the Race Equality Charter, I guess I would challenge them back and say, what's wrong with making sure that we are being fair across all of our business when it comes to race equality, as we would do for gender equality and disability equality? So I would say to them, what's wrong with wanting to be fair?
Absolutely. Binna, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, it's interesting about talking about Black Lives Matter. And that's kind of the obviously the huge this event which triggered these huge demonstrations around the world. A year before that, though, or maybe just over a year before that, as you know, Imogeen, there was the EHRC report into racial harassment into universities. What was I'm not talking about your university specifically, but kind of what did you think? Because that showed all sorts of things, didn't it? I mean, the harassment of an exclusion, and the stereotyping of minority students and staff, the lack of promotion of staff, complaints being ignored. It was significant as a piece of research and an insight into what goes on in higher education. And I'm not even sure what the reaction of the higher education sector was to this quite damning, I saw, observation into what's going on in the universities. And that was well before 2020.
Yeah, you're right there, Binna. So what I remember of that is because I joined the university the year before that. So I joined in, well, not quite a year. I started in the September of 2018. And then I was kind of finding my feet in higher education. Prior to that, I'd worked in local government.
Yeah.
And so, yes, when the Equality and Human Rights Commission published that report, I have to say, I wasn't shocked by its contents, but I was disappointed in terms of it talked about students who were reporting that they felt that they had experienced racial discrimination and had comments made to them by lecturers. And I guess for me, it was disappointing that was happening in sort of 2018, 2019. In our own university, that was the time when I'd started to put in place our governance structures.
Right.
So that was one of the first items that was on our agenda. And it was about getting people to think about all of the work that they do and how the that report, if you like, impacted from their perspective and what they could do. So it was something that we had started to look at. However, I would say that the murder of George Floyd had the biggest impact in terms of making us look internally and say, what are we doing? Have we responded to this report? Have we responded to the Universities UK report as well? So it made us, I think it forced us to look more thoroughly at what we were doing.
Oh, interesting. So actually, the murder of George Floyd led to this degree of introspection, and then also going back, actually, how did we respond? How did we respond to these quite damning reports about life in universities for minority students? Yeah. So what was the university's conclusion when it reviewed their actions?
So we, as a university, we could see that we had started to make progress. So I know on the back of the EHRC report, we had begun to implement a system called Report and Support, which allowed students and staff to report incidents of discrimination, harassment, victimization, either as a named person, or they could respond anonymously. So we were at the very early stages of saying, okay, we need to identify what are the issues in our own organization, so that we can either do some early intervention, we can track trends, we can do some deep dives into those areas where we had most of the reports. So we had started, but what I would say is that momentum was not as swift as it perhaps should have been, but we absolutely had started to look and think, well, how do we find out what's going on in our own organisation?
Right. Yeah, excellent. Sorry, go on, Kitty.
No, you go for it, Binna.
Yeah, the governance structures. Why is that important?
Well, I'd say for a range of reasons, really, because I think that you have to have a two-way flow of information from the very top of the organisation right to the front line. And I think it's about communicating, being able to communicate and listen. So listening to what those issues are from a bottom-up perspective, and then communicating what our response is going to be from a top-down perspective almost, so that there is that dialogue. And also, I think it's really important to have knowledge about what's happening in every part of the business. So once you've got these governance structures in place, you can find out what the key things are that people are talking about in those particular areas. And then you can look at it like a helicopter view and think, okay, these are the issues, these are the things that are common to all, these are the unique things in that particular area. And then you can respond in a more strategic way. I think if you have a systematic way of doing things and you're checking that you've got the right people at the right time looking at those different issues.
Right.
I'm conscious, of course, that the work you're doing is always ongoing, and there's always going to be more to do. You touched on this briefly a few moments ago, the idea of tracking trends, but I'd love to hear more about how have you gone about setting quantitative targets, and how you're measuring success in the short and medium term, Imogeen.
Well, the targets that's interesting, really interesting. So what we've done is, many of the actions in our key plans are things that you can look at and go, we've either done them or we haven't. So for instance, we've either implemented a system where people can report information or we haven't. In terms of a target around that, for us, it was about having an increase in the numbers of reports that we receive over the next couple of years. And I think that's more about making sure that a system is embedded before we start to say, actually, we now want to see those numbers of cases decreasing. We have some tricky targets around recruitment. So we say that we want to have a university that reflects our student body and the city that we serve. Now, in terms of setting a target, that's tricky in terms of trying to understand, well, what's the turnover rate? Where are people leaving? How many staff do we recruit over the years? So again, we haven't been able to necessarily set a firm target, only to say that we need to see an increase. I think where we are specific are around the targets in our access and participation plan, which are also linked through to our EDI strategy and our Black Lives Matter plan, because those are very specific targets around reducing awarding gaps between students who identify as Black, Asian, and minoritized communities. So it's I guess easier to set targets because we have some very definitive numbers in terms of we know what the awarding gap is, we know the numbers of students that we've got, and we can put targets in place. So it's been a balancing act, as in some areas we've been able to have specific targets, others we have to go for a kind of increase until we kind of know what that pattern is going to be. I'm hoping that makes sense.
That made a lot of sense, actually. It's quite a deliberate, rational, analytical kind of approach to this, isn't it? As opposed to plucking a number out of the air.
Yes, because it's easy to pluck a number out of the air, but
and not achieve it.
Absolutely. So we're trying to use that, the SMART targets, be specific, measurable, achievable, all of those things. But I think it's about really understanding what the issue is that you're trying to address and how we go about it. And it takes a very mixed response. Some of it is very specific and targeted. Some of it is around, it might be the way that we promote the work, if you like, of Black academics. So not necessarily putting a number to it, but actually thinking, well, who are our Black academics that are coming through? And how are we promoting them and making sure that their voices are heard as well? So it's a real balancing act in terms of getting targets and performance measures right.
Are you able to touch on some of, again, going slightly off script here, but some of the sort of measure or the work that you're doing to sort of address the imbalance of Black academics that exists? How can that be sort of changed? What work are you specifically doing to alter that, other than promoting the work of those already in seat?
Well, I mean, I guess it's about understanding our pipeline. So, in terms of when we look at our university, we have looked at the numbers, if you like, of undergraduate students by ethnicity. We look at those who go on to do postgraduate taught studies, and then we look at those who go on to do postgraduate research. And what we can see is that there is a real issue in terms of pipeline, in terms of the numbers of students from Black and Asian and minoritized communities that go on to undertake research degrees. So what we've tried to do is do a number of things. For example, looking at studentship, so scholarships to support people so that people have the funding. We were successful in a bid to do a project with Wolverhampton University, and that's about removing barriers to research studies. We are trying to have a grow your own scheme, so we try to look at, because we've got such a diverse student body, we're looking at creating jobs and opportunities in the university so that we can retain our students and support them in their careers. So I think it's a mixed bag of things, and also thinking about when we are recruiting senior people, senior leaders. Often we use headhunters. So for me, it's about making sure that we're using companies that have a track record of recruiting people who are from the backgrounds that we're seeking, and looking at what their, if you like, their values are around EDI. So there's a whole host of things that we're doing from, if you like, the senior recruitment stage and trying to look at where we're advertising roles, looking at how we diversify the selection process. So not just having diverse people sitting on panels, but being part of the job description, person specification, looking at the decisions around where we advertise, what we assess and how we assess. So it's a whole systems approach. And I've said it as though it's really easy to do, and it's not.
Yeah, you said that as though you were so in control of the situation and so many tangible things to do to make the changes.
No, I mean, what I'd say is that we have a clear roadmap in terms of where we want to get to and the things we need to do on the journey. But obviously there is a whole education piece. We've got to support people, help people, bring people along with us. So and there are some areas where we know traditionally in those fields, you're, if you like, hunting in a very, very small pool that isn't diverse. So it's really tricky. So all we can really do is try to look at a range of different things that we can do to try and get us to that destination point.
I was doing some work with a Russell Group university. I won't name them, and I was having a look at some of their material because they were frustrated they couldn't get more senior black academics actually. And I had a look at a recruitment brochure. It was online. It goes out to all the candidates, the potential applicants. And I was kind of flicking through this online, and there was a black woman at the front of the room, and she looked like she was addressing a group of people, like in an academic teaching kind of role. There was another black woman who seemed to be like advising a student. There was a black female who was a student. I remember flicking backwards and forwards through this brochure. There's something not quite right here. It was great to see all of these black women, and there was something not quite right about them. And I flicked through them, and it was the same woman. It was the same woman, hair up, hair down, glasses on, glasses off, jacket on, jacket off. And just flicking through it, and of course, when I pointed this out to the people who were in charge of the academic appointments, you're trying to, this doesn't look authentic at all. They blamed the executive search firm who clearly put it together. But you'd have thought somebody from the university. This was like 2020. They're not talking about the 1970s here. They found one black female. He said, "Can you pretend you're a student? Can you pretend you're a teaching academic? Can you pretend It's dreadful." It's less than 2 years ago, Imogen. This is less than two. It's about a year and a half ago. And kind of that shows you something, doesn't it, about the sloppy, superficial nature of what people think needs to be done. Not just of the university, of the executive search firm as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's right to call it out, and I think that it's about everyone making sure that we call things out as and when we see them, not just relying on those who work in ED&I to be the voice of, actually, this isn't right, this needs to be put right. I just think that actually other people saw that brochure before you saw it, and they should have called it out. And why didn't they?
I'm not even sure they noticed, Imogeen.
Really?
I know. maybe I'm being a bit too kind here. Yeah.
I mean, whichever way you slice or dice that, it's still pretty offensive.
It's a Russell Group. I mean, this is then they're scratching their heads wondering why we don't get representation. Anyway.
Imogeen, it was really interesting hearing just now about the sort of active way that you're trying to close that gap of black academic leadership at the university. And I wonder if you are able to touch a little bit on the similar active work that you're doing or setting into motion to close the attainment gap as well?
Yeah, I mean, so the attainment gap is, well, I would call it an awarding gap.
Awarding gap, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. And I guess, and the reason why I say that is because I think when you use the word attainment, it puts the kind of onus on those students as opposed to awarding, which is about the way the university goes about recognizing and awarding students.
I really like that, incidentally, Imogeen.
Yeah,
Because you mentioned the awarding gap earlier, and I thought, oh, that's smart. It's kind of the use of language here, kind of without realizing it. You are placing the emphasis somewhere different by calling it an awarding gap, and I've not heard it called that before, and I thought, I like that.
Yeah, I think more and more people are calling it an awarding gap because I think that for decades, there's been this kind of narrative that black students don't achieve as well as white students. Whereas when you look at the entire system and process in terms of, we don't all come into higher education from the same level playing field. Many of the students that come to BCU, they are the first in their families to go into higher education. And so they don't necessarily have a network of people who are there supporting them, advising them, helping them with their assignments, etc., that you might have if you come from a family that historically has had a long history of going into higher education. And I think that's about, well, how does the university then adjust and support those students? Because they're coming from such different places. So to assess them and treat everyone the same is inappropriate. And I think it's also about looking at the materials that we use to teach. And often people talk about decolonizing the curriculum. And there's often tension around the term decolonizing. But I guess for me, it's about when you're teaching, looking at examples from all the different continents so that you're not just giving that kind of Eurocentric version of life and what good looks like. I think it's about everybody shifting their mindset and thinking about things globally and looking at their materials and thinking, well, can my students see themselves in what I'm teaching? And also looking at the way that people, do assessments. I think one thing that I say during the pandemic, I'm not sure we're out of it, but we could see a real distinction between students who have access to Wi-Fi, laptops, the space in their homes to study. Many are coming from multi-generational households. A lot of our students were working part-time. So it's really about thinking about what does life look like for our students, and actually is what we're doing advantaging certain groups of students and disadvantaging others, and how do we actually level that playing field? So that's the kind of approach we're trying to take in terms of the awarding gap.
I like that question, actually. Can my students see themselves in my materials? And that's a really simple question to ask oneself, isn't it?
Absolutely. Because I think that there is something about being able to connect with what you're learning.
Yeah.
And being able to call upon your own experiences. And I also think that if people are ignoring, if you like, the achievements of your heritage, in terms of that sense of belonging and feeling like you deserve to be there, I think it can make a huge difference. Because if you're always taught that the kinds of things that are valued in society are coming from communities that don't look like you, and no one's acknowledging the good or the great things that your own community has done, it's difficult to have that self-confidence and self-assurance and feel like, actually, I have a lot to contribute to learning. So it makes a difference.
Oh, it makes a huge difference, that sort of thing. But also the question that you're asking people to ask themselves, I can imagine a lot of people go, yeah, it's a good question to ask, Imogeen. Thank you for posing it. I need to look at whether my students can see themselves in my material. It kind of then you removed it completely from this kind of decolonizing the curriculum, which actually sounds like a grand project, and it's also very emotive. But you made it very practical. What can I do to make my students relate to my materials? It works on many different levels. I think that question that you're posing.
Absolutely. I was just gonna add, Kitty, before you come in, and I was going to say it's not just about the teaching and the materials. I think it's about that entire experience. I went to somebody launched some research that they'd done into the experience of Black students living in student accommodation. And I can't remember who did the research. I do apologize. But it certainly talked about, the different kind of living situations, who people were grouped together in terms of living with, eating with. And it was all about, I guess, some Black students feeling isolated just from the initial get-go in terms of just their basic accommodation and their needs not necessarily being met. So I think it applies not just to that kind of learning experience, but to everything that we do as a higher education institution.
Yeah. That makes it quite different, doesn't it? From an organisation, you're actually dealing with people you're having to deal with where they live, how they live, all of those things, which a business doesn't, or any other organisation doesn't have to deal with necessarily.
Absolutely.
It's a really interesting one, and it's one that actually comes up in sort of EDI conversations time and time again. That piece around visibility, not just in decolonializing the curriculum, but also in our recent conversation, been on sort of LGBTQ plus visibility, and actually, I think with gender as well. It's an interesting one, and definitely overall a very positive movement in the right direction. The next question I was going to ask is quite a meaty question, Imogeen. Of course, tackling systemic problems is a huge challenge. Some of which you can affect, control, or change over, and some that you can't. So what I wonder is, where have you found opportunities to make an impact, and perhaps what makes you nervous, or what have you found particularly challenging through this work?
So, okay, what makes me nervous? So, I mean, when you were asking me a question earlier about the response that some people have had to the Race Equality Charter, that kind of concept of people blaming wokeness or wokery, the language that people use to try and, I think, almost ridicule the work that so many people have been doing in terms of tackling social injustice. So that's what makes me nervous, is the kind of that voice, particularly when it comes from government or senior bodies or people who are, if if you like, traditionally respected as being the authority. When I say traditionally expected, for instance, people respond very differently to, let's say, a 6 foot tall white man in a suit. Back to those kind of examples when people say, imagine that you're boarding a plane and the pilot has just passed you by, and what did the pilot look like? And people often come up with this image of a tall white male, smartly dressed, etc. And I think people come up with those images because they are the kinds of people that, if you like, historically, their voices have been heard. So when we see people who often have that kind of audience, and I'm going to try and stay away from using the word privilege, but I clearly can't. There is something about when people who have unearned privilege use terminology to, if you like, ridicule the if you like, the fight for social justice. That's what makes me nervous, because it's very easy for people to do that, and they have the media as their audience, and so they naturally then have the attention of millions of people. So I guess for me, it's about making sure that different voices are heard, and that when the media puts out stories like that, that they actually find the voices of those who can counter those stories and put that perception right. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. Of course, I mean, BCU does have the Lenny Henry Media Diversity Centre as well, doesn't it? And is that is that one of those counter voices that can be heard?
Well, I mean, I think it's we're very early on the journey. So the Sir Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity was launched 2 years ago. So I think we just celebrated the second birthday for the centre. And since opening, I mean, I think that we've seen them publish some wonderful work in terms of things like the use of terminology and giving guidance to organisations like the BBC. So yes, I would like to see our centre take a lead role in having a kind of counter voice. But I guess that's something that I'll need to kind of share with my colleagues who lead and help to drive that organisation. But I think they're doing some great work to try and challenge that, but we need to see more of that, is what I would say.
You're back. I mean, you came to as you said earlier, actually, you joined the university about 3 years ago.
Yeah, 3.5 years ago.
And you've got extensive experience, principally in working in the public sector. Your PhD was kind of in that area, wasn't it? I mean, you've so much knowledge of the public sector. How does universities and the HE sector compare?
So,
when it comes to race, specifically when it comes to race.
Okay. I mean, I'll start by saying I haven't quite finished my PhD. I started my journey, but having moved to Birmingham and then gone through a pandemic, I'm not quite there yet.
Yeah, difficult times.
But yes, I have worked in local government a lot, and I've also been part of the Council of Governors for a large NHS Foundation trust. And so I guess in terms of looking at race, I think the issues are very different in different public sector organisations,
right,
if you like. So, for instance, if I were to look at the NHS, I would say that, yes, like higher education, the senior leadership in the NHS is very white. And they did publish a report some years ago called The Snowy White Peaks of the NHS, which, the title says it all. But what I would say is about the NHS is that my observation is that you have, if you like, consultants and nurses who come from all over the globe. So, in terms of their skills and the jobs they do, you will find great diversity in terms of their, areas of expertise. However, the leadership lacks diversity, but you still get that expertise, if you like, in terms of the services that are delivered via the NHS. I think in terms of local government, you're seeing a shift, or there has been this real shift in terms of the kind of political makeup of local government. So you get a lot more diversity in terms of councillors, people who go into politics. You seem to get, particularly in areas where you have really diverse, if you like, constituents. So you start to see emerging councillors from different ethnicities coming through. It hasn't quite fulfilled that kind of, what central government looks like in terms of MPs. We're starting to see a bit of a shift. We see a better shift in terms of gender, but we're still not there. And we're seeing more improvement from a race equality perspective. But I would say that local government and the NHS are possibly doing better than higher education in that if I were to look at vice chancellors throughout the UK, I would struggle to find maybe more than one or two vice chancellors who are from Black and Asian backgrounds. There are a couple, but by no means is there like a representative, if you like, leadership from a vice chancellor perspective when it comes to race equality. But what I think is changing are perhaps the makeup of the board of governors, because I think that's a route where universities can attract more diversity. Because even if you're looking at professional backgrounds, say you're wanting an accountant, you've got more and more people of colour coming through who are accountants and could take up those board positions. Or if you're looking at people who have backgrounds in human resources or whatever it might be, I think by diversifying your board of governors in higher education, we can start to bring in more diversity when it comes to race, but we're not quite there.
Your job, I mean, we're talking specifically about race here, but your job is diversity, inclusion, and equality. How big is your team?
Wow, that is a very good question. My team is very, very small, Binna. So my team at the moment consists of, so there's myself as the head of EDI, there's an EDI manager, we've got a colleague who is leading on race equality in terms of our race equality charter work. We have a fabulous administrator. And then we work with other, if you like, charter leads. So we have a Stonewall project manager, leads on LGBT plus inclusion. We have an academic who leads on Athena Swan, which is gender inclusion. And so we work very closely as people who kind of like primarily lead on EDI, but we also have allies throughout the university on various themes. We also have networks. So we've got networks for, if you like, race equity and inclusion, disability equality, etc. And so when I say my immediate team is very small, there is actually a whole body of supporters in different shapes, sizes, and guises who actually champion EDI and do it really effectively. And there are people in faculties who have been doing work on whether we've got our Black Studies program at the university. There's a team there that have been championing social justice and talking about race equality for many years, great expertise. We've got colleagues in different faculties who have done research, whether that's into gender equality or people leading on period poverty, all sorts of, if you like, the different kinds of, if you like, issues and challenges from an EDI perspective. So I kind of see us as a much bigger team than my immediate little team, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that makes a lot of sense, actually. I love that breadth of perspective you have. That actually making the distinction between your immediate team and actually the other people who are actively supporting the work that you're engaged in. The point, the reason for asking you the question, actually, I know the answer was wonderful, but the reason for asking is actually you could kind of think when you're talking about race, when we just talk about race on its own, it's a big enough job, but that's not your whole job. It's like the whole EDI agenda is your job.
Yeah, it's huge, and it's looking across the sort of staff and student perspective as well. So it is a massive job, which is why I would never kind of say that I only have there's only 4 of us working on it. And this is the thing about the whole, if you like, race equality and EDI. It's everyone's responsibility. And I think it's about galvanizing support from wherever you can. If people are championing EDI in whatever form it is, I think it's about us all coming together and working collaboratively and championing equality for all. So whether that's around LGBT plus inclusion or it's about disability equality, I think it's really important for me personally. I don't necessarily just advocate around race equality. For me, it's about advocating just for equality and supporting all groups who are, if you like, minoritized or disadvantaged or marginalized, because I just think that the more people that do that, the more progress we'll make.
It strikes me the more we talk, actually, the fundamental to your work is actually you've got a set of organising principles in your head, and which you've articulated more and more of during the course of this conversation, and that helps you kind of determine how you're going to take a longer term approach to these things and how you're going to marshal the resources that you have. Yeah, it's really fascinating talking to you, actually, just kind of understanding those principles that you go by. But you also take an intersectionality approach, don't you, in your work? How easy is that?
I think that, we try to. I think, how easy is it? I would say it depends on the voices that you include in what you're doing. So I haven't found it to be particularly difficult because for me, it's about making sure that we work with and engage with people from all different perspectives. So if I'm organizing a meeting or anything for any kind of event or activity, it's about including as many people from as many different perspectives as we can in shaping and planning. So,
that's another one of your organising principles, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be really difficult if you are excluding people. So if you're only having a group of people that look like you, talking to you about the things that matter, then you're only going to have that perspective. Whereas if you make sure that you're trying to be as inclusive as possible and give a voice to a whole range of people from different backgrounds, I think it's easier, if you like, to take that intersectional approach because you've always gotten those different perspectives. So yeah, it's not overly difficult if you have a diverse organisation. I imagine if your organisation isn't so diverse or your student body isn't so diverse, it might be trickier.
Yeah. Thank you, Imogeen.
Really interesting. I'm mindful of time now, but I had.
I know. I've just looked at the clock.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. So we've got. There was one last question that we ask all of our our guests, and I'd love to hear your own thoughts or musings in response to this, Imogeen. Could you share one thing that you wish you'd known at the start of your EDI journey, and perhaps something that you might have done differently as a result?
One thing.
Or more. I won't. I know it's a tough one. Answer as you naturally would.
Okay, so I'd say there are a couple of things. I would say that for me, if I'd thought about it right on at the start of my journey, it would have been that EDI runs through absolutely everything that we do. So right from board level to frontline level, and all of those services that happen in between. I think if I'd known that at the start of my journey, that would have been a huge help, because I think I kind of came at EDI from a perspective of what can my little team and I do, as opposed to what should everybody be doing, as opposed, do you know what I mean? So I think that shift in focus has been a huge help. And then I'd say it's been about being specific and practical about the things we're trying to change. Because often you will have these big conversations about things like awarding gaps, which is fine, but actually be specific. Where are those gaps? Exactly where are those gaps? And what can you practically do to make things different where those big gaps are? So for me, it's about just be specific, be practical. It's everyone's responsibility, although people need leadership and direction. But it's about, and I would say my third and final one then would be about accountability. Having named people who are accountable and will drive particular programs and strands. Without that accountability, you're relying a bit on goodwill, which, goodwill is nice, but actually it needs to be somebody's responsibility.
I think those are three very insightful responses there, Imogeen. Thank you. And we literally are out of time now. It's been such a pleasure speaking, Imogeen. Binna, thank you so much for co-hosting with me. It's been a delight having you both in the conversation. So thank you so much for your time today.